Snow lashes the stone walls of Quebec like a living thing. It is the last night of the year 1775, but there is no celebration here, only the slow grinding suspense of men waiting in the storm. The wind howls up from the St. Lawrence, driving sheets of snow into every crack of the ancient French ramparts, icing the ladders, stiffening the ropes, and erasing footprints almost as soon as they are made. The city crouches on its rocky promontory, its upper town walled and bastioned, its lower town a maze of wharves, narrow streets, wooden houses and barricades. Lanterns flicker behind shuttered windows, cannon mouths stare out into the white void. Muskets are stacked near firing steps, their metal chilled to the bone. Inside Quebec, about 12 to 1,800 men hold their positions along the walls and in the lower town. They are a patchwork garrison, British recruits from regular regiments, French-Canadian militia and volunteers, Marines, gunners, sailors turned infantry, officers of long experience and raw boys who have never yet heard a shot fired in anger. At their head stands the British governor, Sir Guy Carleton, a veteran who understands that the city itself is his greatest ally. Stone, height, and heavy guns matter more than bravado in a Canadian winter. Carleton has refused to be drawn into battle in the open fields beyond the walls. Instead, he has chosen to let the fortress and the season do what armies alone cannot. Beyond the walls, in the suffocating darkness of the snowstorm, an American army is moving. It is smaller than it once was, whittled away by disease, desertion, hunger, and the brutal march through the wilderness. But it is still dangerous. In the streets beyond the lower town's barricades, in frozen gullies and half-hidden approaches, the soldiers of the Continental Army are feeling their way forward. Their commanders have gambled everything on this night. If the assault succeeds, Quebec falls, and British Canada may be ripped from the Empire. If it fails, the entire invasion of Canada will die in the snow. On one axis of advance come the men who followed Brigadier General Richard Montgomery down the Lake Champlain route. Months earlier, they had captured St. John's, Chambly, and then Montreal, driving thin British forces before them. Now, in the swirling storm, they feel their way toward the lower town from the south, hugging the frozen shoreline, dragging ladders and artillery through snowdrifts. Somewhere in the darkness, Montgomery himself is pushing forward, convinced that a sudden blow in the storm may overcome the defenders before they can react. On another axis are the survivors of Colonel Benedict Arnold's terrible march through the Maine wilderness. They know what cold means. They have eaten their last rations, boiled their leather, watched comrades fall behind in swamps that are now buried under drifts. They have stood on the heights above Quebec, looked down at the walls, and endured weeks of futile siege in the teeth of winter. Now, under Arnold's direction, they grope forward from the north, heading into the cramped, twisting streets of the lower town, hoping to link up with Montgomery's column in the heart of the city. The storm is both enemy and ally. It muffles sound, hides movement, and blinds sentries. It also makes every step treacherous. Ladders that must be thrown against walls are coated in ice. Musket locks are damp. Powder horns must be shielded under greatcoats. The snow piles high against barricades, turning them into steep white ramps that are harder to climb than timber alone would have been. Men slip and fall, curses lost in the wind, their bodies dark smudges against the glowing whiteness. From the British side, the night is a test of discipline. Inside bastions and along parapets, sentries peer into the blank storm, their eyelashes crusted with ice. Officers move along the walls, checking posts, stamping their boots, ensuring that ammunition is dry and guns are ready. In the lower town, defenders stand behind hastily thrown up barricades of timber and barrels, their lines supported by artillery, carefully sighted in advance. Houses have been prepared for urban combat, loopholes cut in walls, upper stories cleared for firing lines. The defenders have turned the streets themselves into weapons, narrow channels, pre-sighted for crossfire. At some point, amid the gusting snow, the first alarm is raised. Shapes are seen moving where no picket should be. Shots are fired into the darkness. The flashes of powder are momentarily reflected in the storm like distant lightning. The night, which had seemed merely hostile and indifferent, now becomes lethal. The storm's muffling curtain is ripped aside by the blast of cannons from the ramparts. Grape-shot scythes through the whiteness toward unseen targets. Musket volleys roar from behind barricades, the sound booming between the stone houses and the harbor's icy edge. Out in the storm, the American columns stagger into this planned killing zone. Montgomery's men, advancing along the narrow shore, encounter obstacles they can barely see before them. Frozen ladders have to be set up in the teeth of fire, directed from prepared positions. In the choking snow and smoke, the leading ranks take the full force of canister and grape shot. A single blast from a well-sighted gun, loaded with scrap and shot, rips through the head of the column. Officers fall. Men who have marched under the same banners from New York and beyond collapse onto the ice-rimmed path. On the other side of the town, Arnold's column pushes into cramped, twisting streets, only to find them choked with barricades and swept by fire from windows and side alleys. The lower town becomes a labyrinth of death. Every attempt to push forward runs into a crossfire. Every pause invites canister from a battery they cannot see clearly through the storm. The snow itself, which had seemed to offer concealment, now reflects the light of muzzle flashes and gunfire, exposing every movement in a ghostly, flickering tableau. Inside Quebec, Carleton's gamble is paying off. He has refused open battle, trusted to rock, brick, and winter. Now, in the first hours of the new year, as attackers fall back or are captured in droves, the line between British Canada and the American Revolution holds firm. The blizzard has become a weapon in imperial hands, and the continent's northern gateway remains closed to invasion. As dawn crept over Quebec on the first day of 1776, the storm still rolled over the city in gusts, but the battlefield had changed. The American assault, conceived in desperation and launched in hope, had failed. Its battered remnants withdrew into the snow-choked streets beyond the walls, leaving behind prisoners, dead comrades, and the echo of gunfire absorbed by wind and stone. What remained was a siege, long, grinding, and governed by the brutal arithmetic of winter. Inside Quebec, the defenders took stock. They had endured the blizzard, held their positions, and repelled a coordinated assault from two directions. Their losses had been comparatively light. More importantly, their morale, battered by weeks of cold vigilance, now surged. The memory of the night's carnage, American bodies lying stiffening in snow, ladders abandoned in drifts, weapons frozen into gloved hands, was a stark confirmation that preparation and patience had prevailed. The city's architecture had proven its worth. Bastions, walls, and batteries had amplified their limited numbers into a force capable of repelling a determined enemy. Sir Guy Carleton understood the significance of what had occurred. The assault had been the Americans' best chance to seize Quebec before reinforcements arrived in spring. The defeat meant that the siege, already hampered by weather and supply shortages, would likely drag on until the arrival of British ships with fresh troops and provisions. Carleton instructed his officers to ensure that the city remained alert, even vigilant, but he also allowed the garrison to breathe. Quebec had survived one of the most audacious attacks in North American history. Beyond the walls, however, the American army was unraveling. The force that had limped to Quebec after months of campaigning was now trapped in a hostile climate, short of food, medicine, and shelter. Smallpox ravaged their ranks with terrifying speed. Men who had survived the wilderness march were now struck down by disease, shivering in makeshift huts or open encampments where fires barely held back the cold. Frostbite maimed others. The army that had once been driven by the hope of bringing Canada into the Revolution now found itself locked in a hopeless vigil, unable to breach the fortress, yet unwilling to retreat. Arnold, commanding while recovering from his own wound, tried to keep order. Winter supply lines were tenuous at best. Sentries stood guard with muskets that might misfire at any moment, their breath frosting against scarf-wrapped faces. Trenches, impossible to dig in frozen ground, had been replaced by snowbanks and shallow earthworks. Artillery positions, hastily constructed, were half buried by each new snowfall. Powder had to be kept near fires to remain dry, while clothing stiffened into frozen shells overnight. Every day, the British guns reminded the Americans of their vulnerability. On clear mornings, when the wind died down and the cold sharpened rather than muffled sound, cannon from Quebec's walls thundered across the snowy fields. The Americans could do little in response. Their guns were too light to make any impression on the fortress walls. The defenders' strategy was simple but effective: pressure the besiegers, keep them off balance, and let winter continue its slow work. Within the American lines, desertion became a constant threat. Some Canadians who had initially welcomed the invading army now reconsidered their stance. Others, who had remained loyal to Carleton, acted as guides, scouts, or couriers. The American hope that the French-Canadian populace would rise en masse against British rule had proven ill-founded. Those who spoke of independence often found themselves speaking to empty air. Few were willing to abandon their homes in the dead of winter for a cause born far to the south. By February, ration shortages had become acute. The cold gnawed at every man, constant and unrelenting. Fires provided fleeting comfort, but consumed scarce wood needed for construction. Horses weakened and died, their bodies frozen into the landscape. Snowshoes became essential to move supplies across the knee-deep drifts. Men wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth or leather to stave off frostbite. Some failed and lost toes or entire feet. Watches were shortened, and even then, sentries struggled to stay awake, lulled toward numbness by the monotony of white terrain and the ever-present wind. Meanwhile, in Quebec, Carleton's garrison survived by careful rationing and the relative shelter of the fortified city. French-Canadian militia rotated through posts, their local knowledge invaluable for navigating the cold. Regulars maintained steady discipline. Cannons were kept warm and dry, their crews trained to fire even in bitter conditions. Houses, warehouses and churches stored dwindling but manageable supplies. Though conditions were far from comfortable, the defenders were spared the worst ravages seen in the American camps. The situation held in this tenuous balance for months. The Americans lacked the manpower to storm Quebec again, and their siege works were insufficient to starve the city into submission. Carleton, for his part, knew that patience was his strongest weapon. He had only to endure. Spring would bring Thor, and Thor would bring the Royal Navy. That turning point came in May 1776. As the ice broke and the St. Lawrence River began to flow again, lookouts on Quebec's ramparts sighted British sails rising over the horizon. Warships and transports, laden with reinforcements and supplies, began to anchor in the harbour. The effect on the American army was catastrophic. Panic seized the camps. Men abandoned equipment, tents, and artillery in their rush to retreat upriver. Units that had once endured hunger and cold now broke and scattered before the arrival of regular British forces. Carleton wasted no time. He dispatched troops to pursue the fleeing Americans, reclaim abandoned positions, and extinguish the last embers of the invasion. The long winter siege had ended without a final battle. The snow-covered ground surrounding Quebec was silent now, interrupted only by the creak of thawing ice and the distant sound of retreating footsteps. In the final tally, the British held Canada because they held Quebec, and they held Quebec not by sweeping victories in the field, but through endurance, discipline behind stone walls, careful planning, and the relentless support of winter itself. 3.5 decades after the blizzard at Quebec crushed the American bid to bring Canada into the Revolution, winter again became the continent's great arbiter of war. The year was 1812, and what had once been a distant civil conflict in Britain's former colonies now erupted into a full-scale struggle between two nations. The United States declared war on Britain in June, driven by maritime disputes, frontier tensions, and the conviction that the fragile British presence in North America might once again be vulnerable to a determined push. But as before, the idea of conquering Canada collided headlong with the reality of Canada's landscape. Its rivers, forests, frozen roads, and above all, its winters. From the outset, British North America faced a daunting challenge. The colonies were vast, thinly populated, and defended by relatively few regular soldiers. Reinforcements from Britain were limited by the ongoing war against Napoleon in Europe. The geography of Upper and Lower Canada demanded that any defending army stretch itself over hundreds of miles, guarding posts from Detroit to Montreal. Yet despite these disadvantages, the Canadians, British regulars, indigenous nations, and local militia were not helpless. The lessons of 1775 had not been forgotten. Winter, though harsh, could be weaponized. As the first campaigns of 1812 unfolded, both sides tested one another through border skirmishes and isolated battles. The British achieved early defensive victories along the Niagara frontier, in part due to the leadership of indigenous allies and the efforts of officers such as Major General Isaac Brock. But as autumn gave way to winter, the pace of conventional campaigning slowed. Supply lines shortened. Soldiers turned toward woodcutting, fortifying, and preparing for months in which frost and snow shaped all movement. The St. Lawrence River, the lifeline linking Lower and Upper Canada, transformed with the season. In summer, it was a watery highway plied by bateaux and gunboats. In winter, as ice thickened and locked its currents, it became a broad, frozen road. Armies could march across it, but so could raiders. And each side recognized that whoever controlled the St. Lawrence during the winter months controlled communication, transport, and supply along the central axis of Canada. The winter of 1812-13 therefore saw a new kind of warfare. The border communities along the St. Lawrence became both targets and staging grounds. This region was a patchwork of farmhouses, small towns, icy forests, and scattered military outposts. Garrison life was defined by snowshoes, sleighs, and constant patrols. Soldiers learned to recognize the dull creak of ice underfoot, the sound of wind sweeping across open expanses, and the crack of musket fire echoing strangely in the cold air. Though the Americans had failed spectacularly in 1775 to force their way into Quebec, they now sought more modest but equally disruptive goals. Small, highly mobile units of US soldiers, particularly light and rifle companies adept at skirmishing, turned their attention to the Canadian shore. Among them were the men of the 1st US Rifle Regiment under Major Benjamin Forsyth. Known for their marksmanship and boldness, they understood that deep winter offered opportunities unavailable during warmer months. A frozen river meant that defensive positions thought secure behind open water could now be approached from unexpected directions. Forsyth became a central figure in this phase of the conflict. In February 1813, at the height of winter, he led approximately 200 riflemen and militia across the frozen river near Brockville, known in Canada as Elizabethtown. Sleighs carried his men swiftly over the ice-covered expanse. The raid was as swift as it was bold. US troops landed, seized prisoners, disrupted local militia organization, gathered supplies, and escaped before British forces could respond. For the Americans, it was a symbolic and logistical success. It demonstrated that winter could no longer be counted on as a shield for British positions. British and Canadian commanders took these raids seriously. They recognized that small forces could inflict disproportionate damage in winter when settlements were isolated and mobility depended less on roads than on the frozen river itself. Sir George Prevost, the Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief in British North America, understood that the enemy's ability to move across the ice had to be checked. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Red George MacDonell commanded forces along the river with a keen defensive eye and a willingness to act aggressively when circumstances allowed. Throughout the early months of 1813, patrols grew more vigilant. The Glengarry Light Infantry, a distinguished Canadian corps trained in irregular warfare, watched the frontier closely. These men, known for their dark green uniforms and light infantry tactics, were adept at winter movement. They used snowshoes when necessary, carried arms suited to rapid firing and quick maneuver, and maintained an alertness honed by months of skirmishing. Nearby militia flank companies, raised from communities along the river, provided additional strength. The winter landscape forged its own soldiers, men who knew the sound of cracking ice, the direction of the prevailing winds, and the safest paths through snow-choked forests. Winter, however, imposed no mercy on either side. Bitter temperatures reached deep into camps, testing discipline and endurance. Muskets had to be protected against moisture, Powder kept near fires to avoid freezing. Artillery wheels cracked under ice pressure. Patrols took their toll. Numb extremities, frostbite, sleep deprivation, and the constant risk of ambush. Yet the war continued. Winter did not halt conflict, it simply reshaped it. For British North America, this season marked the start of a strategic shift. The Americans had demonstrated that they would strike across the ice, and they had done so successfully. In response, the British would soon show that they too could transform winter's hostile surface into a battlefield, just as they had in 1775 when they had turned Quebec's frozen streets into traps. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic winter counterattacks in North American military history. The coming days would bring a clash on the frozen St. Lawrence itself, with sleigh-mounted guns, light infantry charges, and men in greatcoats and mittens advancing across a white expanse under fire. Winter had ceased to be a backdrop, it had become a weapon. And in the deep cold of February 1813, the British would wield it with decisive effect. The winter of 1812-13 reached its peak along the frozen St. Lawrence, transforming the great river into a broad expanse of snow-covered ice stretching from horizon to horizon. What had once been a natural barrier between warring nations now became a level field of movement, open to anyone bold enough to march across it. Villages, farms, mills, and outposts on both banks felt the tension of waiting for an attack that could strike from any direction. The cold pressed down with unrelenting weight, but the war did not rest. Instead, it adapted. The Americans were first to seize the initiative. Major Benjamin Forsyth, already known for his daring operations along the frontier, understood the tactical possibilities offered by the frozen river. While larger American formations moved slowly or remained fixed in winter quarters, Forsyth's 1st U.S. Rifle Regiment was accustomed to agility, stealth, and quick strikes. These riflemen, selected for their marksmanship and independence, were well suited to winter raiding. They could move lightly, carry their weapons high to protect powder from snow, and navigate the ice with the confidence of frontier hunters. Their most audacious strike came in early February 1813. On the night of February 6th, Forsyth led roughly 200 men, riflemen and militia, across the St. Lawrence toward Brockville, known locally as Elizabethtown. Sleighs and sledges carried their supplies, gliding smoothly over the frozen surface. The moonlight reflected off the ice in a pale sheen, illuminating the distant Canadian shore. Snow muffled their movements, leaving only faint tracks behind them. The cold air was still, sharpening sound so that every metallic clink seemed too loud. Yet the crossing went undetected. Upon reaching the Canadian side, Forsyth's raiders moved quickly. They overpowered local pickets, seized prisoners, including several officers and prominent citizens, gathered weapons and documents, and disrupted the local militia structure. In a matter of hours, they had struck deep into Canadian territory, demonstrating not only their boldness, but the vulnerability of the settlements lining the frozen river. Before British or Canadian militia forces could gather in response, Forsyth withdrew. His men raced back across the ice, hauling prisoners and supplies behind them. The raid, though small in scale, had outsized consequences. It showed that the Americans could move freely across the frozen St. Lawrence and threaten Canada's winter defenses at will. Panic rippled along the river's communities. Settlers who had spent decades living under the shadow of war were reminded once again that peace was precarious. Militia captains reinforced their watch rotations. Families locked their doors before dusk. Communities that had seemed safe behind the natural moat of the river now felt exposed on all sides. British commanders could not ignore the implications. Sir George Prevost, responsible for maintaining the defence of British North America, recognised that the Americans had carved out a dangerous psychological and strategic advantage. To allow US forces to raid with impunity would destabilise the frontier and weaken morale among rural communities, whose support was essential for the war effort. It was therefore necessary to act. Responsibility for countering the American raids fell largely to Lieutenant Colonel Red George MacDonell and his forces at Prescott. MacDonell, known for his boldness and aggressive defence of the frontier, commanded a mixture of British regulars, Canadian militia, and specialized units. Foremost among these was the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles, a corps uniquely suited to winter campaigning. Recruited primarily from Scottish settlers and their descendants, the Glengarrys were trained in light infantry tactics, skirmishing, rapid movement, and irregular warfare. Their dark green uniforms blended into the winter woods far better than the bright red coats of line infantry. Alongside the Glengarrys were detachments from the 8th King's Regiment of Foot, the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles, and militia flank companies from local counties, Grenville, Leeds, Stormont, and Glengarry itself. These men knew the terrain intimately. They knew which stretches of the river froze earliest, where the ice was thickest, where snowdrifts piled high at certain bends. They also understood the importance of maintaining morale and the appearance of strength. If the Americans believed that British forces were timid or unwilling to respond, the raids would only escalate. To prepare for any American incursion, MacDonald ordered increased patrols along the river. Sentries were placed at strategic locations to monitor the ice. British guns, though difficult to maneuver in winter, were mounted on sledges so they could be repositioned quickly. Ammunition wagons were converted into sleighs, militia companies drilled in snowshoe marching, learning to move quietly over deep drifts. Notably, these preparations were not merely defensive. MacDonald understood that to deter further American raids, the British would need to strike back, swiftly, decisively, and in a way that demonstrated mastery of winter warfare. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. Forsyth, encouraged by his success at Brockville, continued probing British defences. His movements, though bold, were being tracked. Each time his riflemen crossed the river, they revealed more about their staging areas and the rhythm of their patrols. MacDonald watched and waited for the moment when he could deliver a counterstroke that would end the American initiative along the icebound frontier. February deepened. Temperatures plunged, solidifying even the thinner sections of the St. Lawrence into iron. Snowstorms rolled over the region at irregular intervals, obscuring vision, burying tracks, and creating new opportunities for concealment. The river, now a frozen battlefield, stretched silently between the two nations as men on both sides prepared for the clash to come. As the final weeks of winter approached, the British grew confident that their preparations had reached maturity. They knew their enemy, they knew the ice, and they knew that the time for response had arrived. Forsyth's next move, they suspected, would bring him within reach of a strike that could reverse the momentum of the season. When that moment came, MacDonald intended to seize it. Soon, the frozen river would bear witness to one of the most daring winter battles ever fought in North America. A clash where sleigh-mounted artillery, light infantry tactics, and a bold advance across an icy expanse would test the mettle of both armies in the depths of winter. The morning of February 22, 1813, broke cold and pale over the St. Lawrence River. A thin winter sun struggled through a veil of cloud, casting a weak glow across the frozen expanse. From Prescott, on the Canadian shore, the town of Ogdensburg lay clearly visible, its wharves, warehouses, frozen slips, and gun positions arranged along the opposite bank. For weeks, the Americans had used Ogdensburg as a base from which to strike at British settlements. But now the river no longer divided the two sides. Instead, it united them across a surface hard as stone. What had once been a barrier had become a battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel Red George MacDonald knew this landscape well. For days he had drilled his men on the ice, making their presence appear routine. Soldiers marched in formation, then withdrew. Artillery sleighs were hauled short distances, then returned to Prescott. These movements, repeated daily, lulled the Americans into complacency. They had seen no signs of imminent attack, only the usual, predictable exercises of a winter-bound garrison. On the morning of the 22nd, however, MacDonald's routine would change. He had at his disposal approximately 520 men, a composite force drawn from the Glengarry Light Infantry, detachments of the 8th King's Regiment of Foot, the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles, and militia flank companies drawn from the loyal counties along the frontier, Grenville, Leeds, Stormont, and Glengarry. Their weapons varied, but each man carried a musket suited to volley or bayonet work. Some light infantrymen, especially from the Glengarry Corps, wielded smoothbores with simple sights for more accurate aimed fire. Supporting them were several pieces of light artillery mounted on sleighs, ready to be dragged across the snow. Across the river, Major Benjamin Forsyth commanded roughly 250 Americans, riflemen of the 1st U.S. Rifle Regiment, and supporting militia. They occupied strong positions among the buildings of Ogdensburg, including fortified houses, gun emplacements, and elevated ground. Forsyth's riflemen prided themselves on accuracy and independence, and they had used Ogdensburg as a base for repeated raids, knowing the British lacked the strength, or perhaps the will, to challenge them in winter. MacDonell intended to change that perception. Shortly after dawn, with daylight beginning to reflect off the snow in cold blue hues, the British force assembled on the ice. What might have appeared to the Americans as another morning drill suddenly revealed itself as something else. Officers moved briskly along the ranks. Sledges bearing artillery were positioned forward. The Glengarry Light Infantry took their places at the head of one column, their dark uniforms contrasting against the endless white. Men adjusted greatcoats, checked muskets, and shielded their powder horns beneath layers of cloth. In the cold air, frost clung to beards, and breaths hung like clouds. Then the order was given. The British advanced across the frozen St. Lawrence. The movement was deliberate, steady, and unmistakably hostile. The ice groaned faintly beneath hundreds of boots, but it held firm. Snow crunched in a rhythmic cadence. Each man's step left a ghostly imprint on the frozen plain. Ahead lay more than half a mile of open ice, exposed, flat, and dominated by American guns. Forsyth's riflemen reacted quickly. Shots rang out from the American shore, the cracks sharp in the frozen air. Balls skipped across the ice, kicking up small sprays of snow. American artillery opened fire next, the concussion rolling across the river, echoing between the Canadian shore and the low line of buildings at Ogdensburg. Smoke drifted from the American batteries, slow and heavy in the cold. The smell of burnt powder carried across the ice. For the British, there was nowhere to hide. The frozen river offered no cover. The men of the Glengarry Light Infantry pressed forward regardless, advancing in disciplined files. Behind them followed the militia flank companies, stepping over patches of drifted snow. The 8th Foot and Royal Newfoundland Fencibles held the second column, which advanced slightly downstream to execute a flanking manoeuvre. MacDonell's plan depended on speed and coordination. If his sleigh-mounted guns could be brought to bear in time, the Americans could be suppressed long enough for an assault into the town. But the snow that had aided movement elsewhere betrayed the artillery here. As the British guns attempted to traverse the ice, they became bogged down in deep drifts. Men strained at ropes, heaving and pushing, but the sleigh runners caught repeatedly. The loss of artillery support threatened the plan entirely. Under mounting American fire, MacDonell made a decision. If the guns could not advance, the infantry would continue without them. The Glengarry Light Infantry broke into a quicker pace. Muskets held low, bayonets fixed. Shots whipped past them, some striking the ice with sharp cracks, others thudding into greatcoats. The Americans intensified their fire, confident that the British assault would break before reaching the shore. But the Glengarrys were experienced in winter fighting. They advanced in loose files, using the imperfections of the ice itself, minor ridges, shallow snowdrifts, to shield their movement. Their volleys answered the riflemen's fire, the sound echoing wide across the frozen terrain. Meanwhile, the second British column, advancing downstream, began to angle toward the American flank. The 8th Foot moved with steady determination, their red coats muted beneath winter gear. The Royal Newfoundland Fencibles, accustomed to harsh climates, pressed close behind them. The American defenders now found themselves threatened from two directions. Forsyth attempted to shift his riflemen to meet the flanking attack, but the British advance was too rapid. The first British troops reached the harbour edge in a rush, clambering over ice ridges and frozen timbers. Close quarters fighting erupted almost immediately among the warehouses and wharves. Riflemen who had moments earlier fired with calm precision now faced bayonets gleaming in the weak winter light. The Glengarry men surged into the lower town, clearing buildings room by room. When the second British column struck the flank of Ogdensburg's defences, American resistance began to buckle. Forsyth recognized the danger and ordered a withdrawal. His riflemen retreated through the town, firing as they fell back, attempting to delay the British advance long enough to escape northward. But the British pressed hard. Gunboats frozen into the harbour were captured and burned. Cannons fell into British hands. American stores were seized or destroyed. In the chaos, many defenders fled into the woods beyond the town, abandoning artillery pieces and ammunition. By midday, the battle was over. Ogdensburg was in British hands. The effects were immediate and profound. The American stronghold, which had threatened the Canadian shore all winter, had been eliminated. More importantly, the British now held the initiative on the frozen frontier. The river, the great artery of Canada, was secure. Settlements that had lived under the shadow of sudden American raids could breathe again, knowing that British forces had demonstrated both the will and the ability to strike back across the ice. Ogdensburg had fallen not through superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but through boldness, coordination, and the willingness to wage war in conditions where a single misstep could mean death. Winter had once again shaped the fate of armies, and for the moment, at least, it had tipped the balance decisively in Britain's favour. In the aftermath of Ogdensburg, the British position along the St. Lawrence strengthened, but the war itself was far from secure. The American threat to Upper Canada continued to grow, and the British High Command recognised a looming crisis. Reinforcements were desperately needed. The garrisons at Kingston, York, and beyond required fresh troops to meet American advances as spring approached. Yet moving men across the vast distances of British North America in winter seemed almost impossible. The roads were buried, the rivers sealed by ice, and the forests thick with drifts that swallowed horses and carts alike. Yet in the cold heart of New Brunswick, one regiment prepared to do the impossible. The 104th Regiment of Foot, raised from communities across New Brunswick, had spent the early years of the war guarding Britain's remote Atlantic flank. Now, in the first weeks of 1813, they received orders that would push them into the annals of military endurance. 6 companies, consisting of roughly 20 officers and about 550 men, were instructed to march overland from Fredericton to Quebec, and from there to Kingston. The distance was extraordinary, roughly 1,100 kilometres, or about 700 miles. More daunting still was the season. It was mid-February. Temperatures routinely plunged below 25 degrees Celsius and sometimes near 31 degrees Celsius. Snow piled waist-deep beneath dense forest canopies. Rivers, though frozen, offered no guarantee of safe passage. Yet the regiment set out. Beginning on February 16th, the 6 companies left Fredericton one at a time, each departing a day apart to avoid exhausting the limited accommodations on the route. The soldiers wore thick wool greatcoats, essential not as comfort, but as protection against life-threatening cold. Snowshoes were issued for deep drifts. Toboggans carried ammunition, spare clothing, medical chests, and rations. French-Canadian sleigh drivers, accustomed to the harsh terrain, accompanied the regiment, guiding them along narrow forest paths cut through New Brunswick's wilderness. The march quickly revealed its character. This was not an orderly parade along roads, but a seemingly endless struggle against the land itself. Snowshoes pressed into the powder, leaving broad staggered trails behind each company. Every step required effort. Every hill was a test of balance and stamina. The cold sank through layers of wool, numbing hands and feet, freezing breath into beards and scarves. Sleep offered little comfort. Soldiers billeted in log houses or barns, crowding near fireplaces that barely softened the night's chill. Boots left too near flames dried rigid, sometimes cracking. Boots kept on became encrusted with ice. Lieutenant John Lecouteur of the 104th would later recount the journey in vivid detail, describing frozen beards, stiff clothing, and the endless rhythm of snowshoe steps. The regiment often marched 30 or more kilometres a day through logging roads and forest tracks. Each company leaned heavily on the help of local inhabitants, Acadian and French-Canadian families who shared food, lent horses, and provided warm lodgings wherever possible. In many villages, the arrival of the 104th transformed a quiet winter night into a sudden bustle of wood chopping, cooking, and preparations for exhausted soldiers. Rations on the march would have been meagre by summer standards, but in winter they were vital for survival. Salted meat, bread, and kettles of stew greeted the columns whenever commissariat sleighs managed to meet them. Occasionally, a local family would provide wine or hot soup, the kind of small comfort that company diaries later described as the best meal we had ever tasted. These simple foods restored strength as the regiment pushed deeper into the frozen interior. The 104th's forces included men of diverse backgrounds. Among them were black soldiers who endured the same hardships across the icy trail. Their presence on the march stands as a reminder that British service in Canada drew upon many communities, united not by birthplace, but by regimental loyalty and necessity. In the snowbound forest, distinctions of race dissolved before the shared reality of endurance. By early March, the lead companies reached the outskirts of Quebec City. The journey had taken just over 3 weeks, a remarkable feat given the conditions. Total distances marched varied, but estimates placed the Fredericton to Quebec leg alone at roughly 350–550 kilometers, depending on the route taken by each company. Snowshoe tracks marked every mile. The soldiers entered Quebec to astonished looks from townspeople who understood the magnitude of such a winter journey. Though exhausted, the men of the 104th had performed a logistical miracle. But their march was far from over. After resting in Quebec City for several days, the companies pressed onward along the St. Lawrence toward Kingston. This leg of the route exposed them to biting winds that rushed down the frozen river corridor. Snowstorms swept over the marchers without warning, reducing visibility to a few paces. Icicles grew stiff on their greatcoats. Muskets had to be inspected regularly for frost damage. Yet they advanced steadily, driven by the knowledge that their arrival in Upper Canada would significantly strengthen British defences. Their total journey approached 100 kilometres before they finally reached Kingston on the northern shore of Lake Ontario. This winter march, longer than many European campaigns conducted in fair weather, demonstrated something profound about warfare in Canada. The land itself demanded adaptability, ingenuity, and a tolerance for hardship beyond the expectations of typical military practice. In making the journey, the 104th had shown that British forces could move across the continent even in deep winter, linking the Atlantic colonies to the central Canadian front during a season traditionally reserved for rest. Their arrival had strategic consequences. With the spring thaw approaching, a stronger British position at Kingston helped secure the upper Great Lakes and the main transportation routes. Reinforced garrisons could now better contest American operations aimed at cutting the St. Lawrence lifeline. In this way, the 104th's march was not merely an act of endurance, it was a strategic triumph, one that allowed Britain to sustain its war effort across a frozen nation. Winter, which had once threatened to isolate British outposts, had instead been conquered by discipline, planning, and sheer human resilience. The men of the 104th had proven that the Redcoat could match the Canadian winter stride for stride. With the 104th Regiment now reinforcing the Central Canadian Theatre and the victory at Ogdensburg, providing breathing room along the St. Lawrence, British North America entered the winter of 1813–14 with a sense of tenuous stability. Yet war in this region was never decided by a single season or a single victory. The frontier remained vast, its rivers and forests stretching across hundreds of miles. Each settlement, each blockhouse, each small garrison represented both a point of strength and a point of vulnerability. As the weather hardened and the days shortened once more, the struggle for control of Canada did not ease. It simply changed form. Winter along the frontier governed everything. It shaped the way armies moved, the way supplies were transported, and the way communities supported the war effort. The St. Lawrence, which had been a stage for battles and raids, now froze again into a white corridor. To the north, forests thick with spruce and birch muffled the sounds of distant patrols. Snow blanketed the rolling farmland, burying fences and footpaths, forcing both armies to adjust their routines. Within British posts, life settled into a rhythm dictated by survival. Garrisons cut timber daily, harvesting wood for heating and construction. Men hauled logs on sledges to fortify positions or build winter quarters. Bomb-proof shelters, roofed with planks and insulated by snow, offered protection against the harshest nights. Where available, stone structures, mills, warehouses, and fortified farmhouses were prized not merely for their defensive value, but for their capacity to withstand the relentless cold. Muskets required constant attention. Powder had to be kept dry at all costs. Soldiers stored cartridges in leather pouches beneath layers of wool, and even then, moisture threatened to seep in. At night, when the cold deepened and frost-coated metal parts, weapons were kept close to fires, often disassembled and cleaned daily. Bayonets had to be checked for brittleness. Sudden temperature changes could crack metal weakened by years of service. Patrolling became both essential and dangerous. Light infantry and militia detachments were tasked with monitoring the ice, watching for signs of American movement. Snowshoe marches became routine. In deep drifts, each step sunk into powder up to the knee or higher, forcing men to lift their legs laboriously with every pace. Patrols advanced along the riverbanks, across frozen coves, and through forest trails where the trees shielded them from the wind but created new hazards. The silence of the winter woods was deceptive. A careless step could snap a branch loud enough to betray an entire patrol. The wind, shifting suddenly, could disguise the approach of an enemy column. Communities along the frontier played a critical role. French-Canadian habitants, British settlers, loyalists, and indigenous allies all contributed to the defence in ways both direct and subtle. Farmers provided sleighs, horses, food, and shelter for passing troops. Local guides led detachments through hidden pathways, warning officers of thin ice or unsafe crossings. Militia companies, often composed of neighbours and relatives, took turns watching the river, ready to mobilise at a moment's notice. In many ways, the war in winter blurred the line between soldier and civilian. Entire communities became part of the defensive network. For the British High Command, supply remained the greatest challenge. The frozen St. Lawrence allowed rapid movement of sleighs, but only so long as the ice held. The thickness of the ice changed with temperature, often unpredictably. Dead weight could cause sudden cracks. The combined load of an artillery piece and crew was enough to threaten collapse in weaker sections. Officers learned the signs of dangerous ice, faint lines of grey amid white, irregular patches where snow had not settled, the muffled creak beneath boots that signalled hidden fractures. To safeguard crucial winter supply routes, the British established a chain of posts from Quebec to Kingston. Each post stored food, ammunition, and tools. Soldiers rotated through these stations, building a web of security that allowed larger formations to move quickly when necessary. It was this same network that had enabled the 104th to complete their monumental march weeks earlier. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to look for opportunities. While larger operations demanded fair weather and navigable rivers, winter allowed light forces to probe British defences. Riflemen, militia, and small detachments from the United States Army crossed the ice in search of isolated posts or lightly defended settlements. These raids rarely aimed to capture territory. Instead, they attempted to disrupt supply chains, seize prisoners, and undermine the confidence of the local populace. Yet the British position was stronger now. The lessons of the previous winter had been absorbed. Patrols operated with discipline, responding quickly to any signs of movement. Militia were better organised. Supply lines, though fragile, were more closely guarded. The British command had also gained confidence in their ability to use winter to their advantage, rather than viewing it solely as an obstacle. Winter warfare had become a skill, one learned through harsh experience. This season of watchfulness and preparation forged the armies that would soon clash in one of the most dramatic winter defences of the war. For as the winter of 1813-14 drew toward its end, American commanders once again looked north across the frozen border and saw what they believed was an opportunity. A stone mill near the frontier town of La Colle seemed to them an isolated post, lightly defended and vulnerable to a strong push. It was a miscalculation. In late March 1814, when snow still clung to the ground and the air carried the sting of winter, a force of roughly 4,000 American troops marched toward Lecole Mills. Their goal was to break the British line, seize control of the approaches to Montreal, and deliver a decisive blow before the spring campaigns began. But what awaited them at Lecole was not a weak outpost, nor an army unprepared for winter fighting. Instead, they would find one of the most determined defences of the war, mounted from behind thick stone walls, organised by seasoned officers, and supported by the very landscape they hoped to overcome. Winter had humbled invaders before. At Lecole Mills, it was about to do so again. In the last days of March 1814, winter still clung to the landscape of Lower Canada. Though the calendar declared the arrival of spring, the weather refused to concede. Snow lay in ragged patches across the frozen ground, ice rimmed the edges of rivers, and a raw, cutting wind swept through the leafless woods. It was in this brittle landscape, neither fully winter nor fully spring, that one of the most pivotal clashes of the War of 1812 unfolded. For the Americans, the campaign of early 1814 offered a chance to recover momentum. The defeats and stalemates of the previous year had frustrated their leadership. Supplies were short, morale was uneven, and strategic gains had been limited. Yet American commanders believed they saw a weakness in the British line. Near the small frontier settlement of Lecole stood a stone mill, a sturdy structure built for grinding grain, but in wartime, a potential fortress. American scouts reported that the mill was lightly defended. If seized, it could serve as a forward position from which to threaten Montreal, undermine British control of Lower Canada, and perhaps force a favourable conclusion to the war. Thus, on March 30th, 1814, an American force of roughly 4,000 men under Major General James Wilkinson marched north toward the mill. Their numbers were imposing. Regular infantry, artillery batteries, and supporting units formed a column that stretched across the muddy, snow-streaked road. Officers carried maps and compasses. Engineers brought tools to dismantle barricades and fortify captured ground. The Americans believed that overwhelming force alone would secure victory. Opposing them, however, was a garrison of only about 80 British regulars, primarily from the 13th Regiment of Foot, supported by a handful of artillery pieces. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hancock, recognized immediately that he could not meet the American army in open battle. Instead, he would use the terrain and the structures at Lecole to create a defensive position strong enough to withstand the assault until reinforcements arrived. The stone mill was the key. Built with thick walls and narrow windows, it offered protection from musketry and even from light artillery. Hancock positioned his small force inside and around the building, cutting loopholes in the walls for muskets, placing a field gun within the mill itself, and situating additional guns to sweep the approach. Outside, the ground was still soft from thaw, turning patches of the fields into treacherous mud. Snow lay in ridges along the edges, complicating movement for attackers. As Wilkinson's force advanced, the British defenders watched from behind their thick stone walls. The size of the American army would have intimidated almost any garrison, but Hancock's men did not falter. They knew reinforcements were within marching distance. Their task was to hold. Shortly after noon, the American artillery opened fire. The concussion of the guns rolled across the fields, echoing against the forest. Shots struck the walls of the mill with heavy thuds, chipping stone but doing little real damage. Smoke billowed across the battlefield, drifting in coils over snow patches and muddy ground. Behind the guns, American infantry formed ranks, ready to push forward as soon as the defenders weakened. Yet the British artillery, though limited in number, responded fiercely. From the mill, a gun crew fired through a makeshift embrasure, sending solid shot hammering into American ranks. Flanking guns added their fire, their positions chosen to create interlocking fields of fire. Each British shot slowed the American advance, forcing their columns to scatter and reform. The Americans attempted multiple approaches. One column moved toward the mill along the main road, slipping in muddy ruts and stumbling over frozen clumps of earth. Another attempted to use the forest for cover, pushing through dense trees where snow still clung to branches. Wilkinson's artillery repositioned frequently, seeking an angle of attack that could breach the stone walls. But each time the Americans shifted, the British adjusted their fire. The defenders inside the mill were protected, disciplined, and resolute. As the fighting continued, British reinforcements began to arrive. Units drawn from nearby posts marched toward the sound of battle, their greatcoats flapping in the wind, muskets carried at the trail. These additional troops, eventually bringing the British force to around 400, filtered into defensive positions around the mill and along the riverbank. Their arrival tightened the defensive line and boosted morale inside the stone structure. American officers pressed their men forward again and again, urging them across open ground swept by musket and cannon. But the mud slowed them, the snow hindered their footing, and the stone mill refused to yield. Every American attempt to mass for a decisive assault dissolved under disciplined volleys from loopholes and windows. Each time the attackers closed the distance, the British artillery, firing from behind thick stone, tore through their formations. The battlefield became a grim tableau of churned mud, drifting smoke, and scattered bodies. By late afternoon, Wilkinson faced a difficult truth. Despite superior numbers and artillery, his army had failed to make any significant breach in the British defences. The mill stood intact, its defenders unbroken. The weather, the terrain, and the British discipline had combined to blunt every American effort. Losses mounted, fatigue spread, and ammunition ran low. The attack had become untenable. Wilkinson ordered a withdrawal. The American columns pulled back from LaColle Mills under fading light, their retreat marked by the slow trudging of men exhausted by hours of fighting in unforgiving conditions. British troops, still holding the stone mill, watched their departure in silence, surrounded by shattered trees, fallen branches, and the scattered debris of battle. The defense had held, against overwhelming odds and in the heart of winter's lingering grasp. For Britain and Canada, the victory at LaColle Mills was more than a tactical success. It reinforced the lesson repeated throughout the previous decades. Winter in North America could be a decisive ally when used with foresight and determination. Stone walls, disciplined infantry, and well-sighted artillery could transform even a small garrison into an immovable bastion against a far larger army. At LaColle, as at Quebec decades earlier, winter had helped shape the outcome. And once again, the northern frontier remained in British hands. Across the decades spanning 1775 to 1815, the British defence of Canada relied on more than fortifications, troop numbers, or battlefield manoeuvres. Time and again, winter itself emerged as the decisive factor, a force equal to armies, one that shaped strategy, dictated tactics, and tested the limits of human endurance. For the British and their Canadian and Indigenous allies, mastering the winter became as crucial as mastering the musket. The Redcoats who held Quebec, who marched across an entire continent, and who fought on the frozen St. Lawrence all understood that victory in Canada required not merely fighting the enemy, but fighting the climate. Tactics evolved to meet these realities. The thick wool greatcoat, issued to British soldiers as standard kit, became more than a garment. It was a shield against the cold. Its heavy layers trapped heat while protecting the body from freezing winds. Without it, exposed skin could become numb within minutes during harsh patrols. When combined with wool mittens, leather boots wrapped in extra cloth, and woolen scarves drawn high, these layers gave soldiers the resilience needed to stand for hours atop ramparts, march through deep drifts, or fire muskets in sub-zero temperatures. Yet clothing alone did not win battles. The British developed winter formations and routines designed specifically for survival. In frozen conditions, sentry duty became one of the most dangerous assignments. Men rotated through posts more frequently, sometimes every 30 minutes during severe storms. Officers walked the lines, checking each position to ensure that soldiers remained awake, alert, and physically able to respond. Fires were positioned behind windbreaks to provide warmth without revealing the garrison's position. Powder was stored near heat sources, yet with meticulous care to prevent accidental ignition, a constant balance of necessity and risk. Artillery crews faced unique challenges. In deep winter, cannon had to be warmed before firing, If allowed to chill completely, the sudden heat of ignition risked cracking the metal. Crews sometimes lit small fires beneath their guns or draped warmed blankets across the barrels. The sleigh-mounted artillery used at Ogdensburg demonstrated an innovative adaptation to the frozen frontier. Gun carriages were modified with runners, allowing pieces to glide over the ice like oversized sledges. But this advantage was fragile. Snowdrifts, too deep or too soft, could halt these guns entirely, as happened during the tense moments when British artillery bogged down on the ice before Ogdensburg. Such challenges demanded quick thinking, often forcing infantry to advance without artillery support. Infantry tactics also transformed. The classic British line, 2 ranks of redcoats firing volleys in steady succession, remained the core of battlefield doctrine. But winter demanded flexibility. Light infantry units like the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles employed looser formations, fanning out across snowfields or approaching through forested trails where snow muffled their steps. They moved with the confidence of men trained to fight in all seasons, their muskets held close to shield powder from moisture and snowflakes. Their ability to traverse the winter landscape quietly and quickly allowed them to screen larger units, harass raiders, or strike at vulnerable points along the enemy line. Snowshoes became essential tools. Adopted from indigenous and French-Canadian traditions, they allowed troops to move more easily across soft snow. The 104th Regiment's Winter March showcased their value on an operational scale, but smaller detachments used them daily during patrols. Snowshoes distributed weight across a wider surface, preventing soldiers from sinking knee-deep with each step, a difference that meant hours saved and energy conserved. Toboggans and sleighs, likewise borrowed from local knowledge, transformed the way supplies moved across the frozen landscape. The combination of European discipline and North American technique produced a hybrid approach to winter warfare that few armies in the world could match. Weapons themselves behaved differently in the cold. The standard British musket, the India-pattern Brown Bess, was sturdy, but a flintlock in winter required careful maintenance. Powder fouling could freeze, flints could become brittle, and the metal surface could collect frost that interfered with firing. Soldiers often carried spare flints and spent long hours scraping barrels and locks with knives to keep them functional. Even so, misfires were common during snowstorms or intense cold. In contrast, American riflemen, particularly those under Forsyth, carried rifled weapons capable of remarkable accuracy, but more susceptible to fouling and slower to reload. On the frozen river at Ogdensburg, accuracy gave way to speed. British volleys and bayonet charges proved far more effective than individually aimed rifle fire in the open whiteness of the battlefield. The environment shaped combat at a more visceral level as well. Snow altered the soundscape of war. In storms, gunfire became muffled, absorbed into falling snow and swirling wind. In clear weather, the hard ice beneath the St. Lawrence amplified every crack and boom, making distant volleys echo across miles. Smoke from muskets and cannons hung low over frozen ground, forming dense clouds that could suddenly blind an entire sector. In the blizzard at Quebec, drifting snow mixed with powder smoke to create an eerie, shifting fog in which attackers and defenders saw only flickers of light from musket volleys. Terrain further shaped the conflict. At Quebec, steep cliffs and narrow streets turned winter assaults into death traps. At Ogdensburg, the flat, open ice granted the defender an unobstructed field of fire, but also exposed them to flanking moves once the British reached solid ground. At Le Col Mills, thawing mud and lingering snow created treacherous footing that slowed American columns, prevented rapid redeployment, and magnified the effects of British artillery. Winter transformed landscapes and dictated how battles unfolded. Beyond tactics and tools, winter influenced soldier psychology. Fatigue was constant. The cold seeped into bones, weakening resolve. Patrols required immense discipline, forcing men to remain vigilant, even when numbness crept into limbs. Officers learned to monitor not just ammunition or rations, but the physical and emotional stamina of their troops. Morale became tied to small comforts: warm barracks, fireside meals, dry socks, or the promise of rum rations that could thaw numb hands and revive spirits. Winter also shaped strategic decisions. Armies in this theatre seldom launched large offensives in deep winter. Instead, winter campaigns were built around raids, defensive actions, and the movement of small detachments. But when major operations did occur, like the assaults on Quebec, the Battle of Ogdensburg, or the American offensive at Le Col, they often produced decisive outcomes precisely because winter compounded every error and magnified every advantage. A misjudged crossing, a poorly scouted approach, or an overextended line could collapse in moments under winter's harsh scrutiny. For Britain, mastering winter proved essential to holding Canada. From Quebec's walls in 1775 to the stone mill in 1814, the British showed an ability not only to endure winter, but to use it as a force multiplier. Winter revealed strengths in engineering, discipline, and training that might have been less decisive in summer. It rewarded the careful, the deliberate, and the adaptable. It punished the reckless. In the Canadian theatre, winter was never merely a season. It was a combatant, unyielding, omnipresent, and unforgiving. The British learned to fight alongside it, to let cold and snow weaken their enemies even before muskets fired or bayonets crossed. And time and again, winter proved itself one of the Empire's most reliable allies. Through every campaign fought in the Canadian winter, from the blizzard-bound assault at Quebec to the marches and battles of the War of 1812, the endurance of the soldiers themselves stands as one of the most remarkable elements of the story. Wars are often remembered for generals, strategies, and outcomes, yet it is the daily struggle of the ordinary soldier, British, Canadian, Indigenous, and American, that reveals the true harshness of winter warfare. Beneath the sweeping narratives of victory and defeat lay countless moments of suffering, resilience, and human determination against conditions that would defeat many modern armies. For the Redcoats stationed in Canada, the cold was not an occasional inconvenience, but a constant adversary. Soldiers accustomed to the chill of British winters found themselves in a climate that pushed human endurance to the brink. Temperatures could plunge far below freezing for days on end. Frostbite, in many instances, became as feared as enemy fire. Sentries on exposed posts often returned with hands or feet numb beyond recovery. Veterans learned to stamp their boots rhythmically, not out of habit, but out of necessity to preserve circulation. During the unsuccessful American siege of Quebec in 1775-76, the human cost of winter was stark. American soldiers, many poorly dressed, malnourished, and weakened by disease, endured the brutal combination of smallpox and exposure. Their shelters, thrown together in haste, provided little insulation. Snow seeped through gaps in their makeshift huts. Fires struggled to survive the wind. One misstep in routine, one night spent too far from warmth, could result in frostbite so severe that limbs turned black with necrosis. Men who had endured the march through the Maine wilderness found the siege camp an even greater crucible. Many succumbed not to British guns, but to the relentless grind of sickness and cold. Even within the walls of Quebec, garrison life had its burdens. Although better sheltered and supplied, British troops still laboured under the demands of constant vigilance. Every day required woodcutting, watchwalking, and maintaining readiness in conditions where metal became brittle and muskets froze if neglected for even a short time. The psychological toll of confinement during a winter siege compounded the physical strain. Men lived in cycles of routine, punctuated by alarms, stands-to, and bursts of gunfire. Sleep came in short intervals, always with blankets damp from condensation and boots placed near the hearth to dry for the next day's duties. Years later, during the War of 1812, the harsh realities of winter remained unchanged. The 104th Regiment's march from New Brunswick to Quebec, and then onward to Kingston, exemplified endurance on a scale rarely matched in military history. Soldiers walked hundreds of miles on snowshoes, their feet blistered and raw from constant friction. Each night, greatcoats were stiff with frozen sweat. Beards iced over, fingers cracked from dryness, and every breath seared the lungs with cold air. Yet the regiment marched on, driven by duty and camaraderie. The march demanded not only physical strength, but mental resilience. Each morning, men forced themselves up from stiff bedding, lacing frozen boots, or brushing off hoarfrost that had formed atop their blankets. Food on the march was plain and scarce. Salted meat, hard bread, and occasional hot meals from snowbound homesteads kept the men alive, but seldom satisfied. The appearance of wine or freshly cooked stew, rare luxuries provided by French-Canadian families or commissariat sleighs, was a morale boost of astonishing magnitude. Men remembered these moments in their journals, describing them with gratitude that seemed disproportionate to modern readers. Yet in the context of relentless cold and fatigue, small comforts became profound. Winter's psychological strain was felt across ranks. Officers bore the responsibility of sustaining morale under conditions that invited despair. They monitored their companies closely, ensuring that no man stood too long in the cold, that clothing was properly dried, that fires were maintained, and that rum rations were distributed fairly. Leadership became as much about survival as combat. A careless decision, a march extended too long, a picket line posted in an exposed location, a ration wagon delayed, could result in casualties without a single shot fired. Indigenous allies, whose knowledge of winter travel far surpassed that of European-trained troops, played a vital role in both wars. They taught British troops to read snow conditions, to recognize the signs of weakening ice, to build shelters quickly, and to navigate forests where storms could disorient even experienced woodsmen. Their skills reduced casualties and improved mobility, integrating centuries of local experience into British operations. Winter was not merely endured, but understood through indigenous expertise. American forces endured their own hardships. In winter raids across the St. Lawrence, riflemen under Forsyth braved the same lethal cold as their opponents. Their movements across the ice were fraught with danger. One miscalculated step could plunge a man into frigid water, where survival chances were slim. When raiding Canadian settlements, they did so knowing that British or militia patrols could counterattack swiftly. The strain of constant readiness, coupled with extreme cold, wore heavily on their endurance. During the Battle of LaColle Mills, the American soldiers who marched through slush and lingering snow toward the stone mill experienced exhaustion from hours of fighting in wet, freezing ground. Mud clung to their boots, dragging them down. Muskets fouled. Ammunition became damp. Their attacks were slowed not only by British fire, but by failing limbs numbed by cold. Retreat offered little relief. Withdrawing through terrain churned into mud by thousands of feet only deepened fatigue. While winter shaped tactics and strategy, it was the unyielding endurance of ordinary soldiers that carried these campaigns forward. The men who stood behind Quebec's icy palisades, who crossed the frozen St. Lawrence into Ogdensburg, who marched through forests on snowshoes, and who defended the stone mill at LaColle, bore burdens seldom captured in official reports. Their resilience transformed harsh seasons into tools of war. Winter may have been the great equalizer of the Canadian frontier, but it was human willpower, expressed in countless acts of perseverance, that determined whether armies survived long enough to fight another day. In this crucible of ice and hardship, the British soldier, supported by local allies and tempered by discipline, proved capable of feats unmatched in many theatres of the Napoleonic era. From the blizzard-swept ramparts of Quebec in 1775 to the frozen river crossings and stone mill defences of the War of 1812, winter shaped every major turning point in Britain's struggle to hold Canada. It was a force that punished the unprepared, rewarded the deliberate, and exposed the limits of ambition. American commanders learned this at great cost, while British leaders, soldiers, and local allies built a defensive system rooted not only in fortifications and firepower, but in the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Winter became a shield, unyielding, strategic, and profoundly influential. At Quebec, the lesson was unmistakable. The American assault on the final night of 1775, launched under the belief that a blizzard would offer concealment, proved instead that winter amplified every strength of a well-prepared defender. The snowstorm turned narrow streets into killing zones, magnified the advantages of stone walls, and immobilized the ladders and artillery the attackers depended upon. Cold tempered the resolve of the invaders, sapped their strength, and turned their siege camps into graveyards of disease and frost. Carleton's decision to let the fortress and the season work in tandem was vindicated when spring brought British reinforcements sailing up the thawed St. Lawrence, scattering the remnants of the American invasion. The frozen river, at once a threat and an opportunity, reappeared decades later as the central artery of the War of 1812. Along the St. Lawrence, winter challenged both armies, but offered pathways for those who learned to navigate it. Forsyth's raid on Brockville demonstrated winter's potential for surprise. Sleighs glided across the ice where boats could not sail, and riflemen struck deep into enemy territory before slipping back over the frozen frontier. The raid showed that winter neutrality could be broken, that rivers were no longer borders, and that Canadian settlements could be vulnerable. Yet this apparent American advantage spurred a decisive British adaptation. Macdonald's counterstroke at Ogdensburg turned winter risk into winter mastery. The British used the frozen surface as a battlefield, marching in full daylight across an open plain of ice, an act that would have been suicidal in summer, when the Americans commanded the river with gunboats. But on that winter morning in February 1813, with the ice thick and the river locked, the British marched with disciplined confidence. The absence of cover mattered less than the precision of their advance, and the leadership that adjusted to the failure of artillery on the drifts. The bayonet, the volley, and the willingness to close the distance succeeded where sleigh-mounted guns faltered. By seizing Ogdensburg, the British reasserted control over the winter frontier, securing the vital corridor that linked Lower and Upper Canada. Winter's strategic influence reached its peak with the march of the 104th Regiment. Few military movements in the era rivaled it. Crossing forests, rivers, and settlements buried in deep snow, the 104th showed that Britain could shift forces across continental distances, even in the dead of winter. This unprecedented mobility ensured that the garrisons at Quebec and Kingston would not face spring alone. It also demonstrated a logistics system that, though fragile and improvised, could be stretched across hundreds of miles through sleighs, snowshoes, and the cooperation of local communities. In doing so, the march transformed winter from an obstacle into a strategic enabler. At LaColle Mills, winter again shaped the outcome. The American army, though numerically dominant, struggled across thawing ground, muddy approaches, and lingering snow that slowed their movements and disrupted their formations. The British defence, anchored in a stone mill whose walls absorbed artillery fire, capitalized on every advantage the season offered. While American guns mired in mud and infantry floundered in slush, British gunners fired from dry, protected positions. Reinforcements marched over firm ground and arrived in time to repel successive American efforts. Winter did not merely play a supporting role. It defined the tempo, limited American tactical options, and magnified the defensive power of the mill. Across these episodes, a pattern emerged. Winter exposed the vulnerability of extended American supply lines. It rewarded the British focus on fortified positions, interior lines of communication, and the integration of local knowledge, whether drawn from French-Canadian habitants or indigenous guides. It punished large-scale American offensives that required long marches and robust logistics, neither of which fared well in sub-zero temperatures. Winter created friction for the attacker, and friction in warfare is often enough to decide outcomes before the first volley is fired. Perhaps most significantly, winter shaped the identity of the British soldier in Canada. No longer simply European infantrymen transplanted across the Atlantic, these redcoats became a unique hybrid of imperial discipline and frontier adaptation. They wore greatcoats crusted with frost, fired muskets warmed by embers, marched on snowshoes provided by local allies, and slept in fur-lined cabins donated by Canadian families. The army that held Canada became a winter army, one hardened by the climate and capable of feats far removed from conventional European expectations. Winter also influenced the broader narrative of the continent. The British ability to preserve Canada through extreme seasons laid the groundwork for the emergence of a vast northern territory, distinguished not by conquest, but by endurance. The frontier communities that supported soldiers, guided patrols, and guarded supply lines became the backbone of a military system that thrived where others faltered. Local militias, often dismissed by American observers, proved invaluable, not just for their fighting ability, but for their intimate understanding of how to survive and move in harsh conditions. Ultimately, Britain held Canada not because it deployed overwhelming numbers or because its armies crushed their opponents in decisive summer battles. Rather, Britain held Canada because its soldiers, commanders, and allies learned how to survive, adapt, and fight in a climate that defeated others. Winter became part of the defensive strategy, a recurring ally that nullified invasions, hardened troops, and protected vast distances that might otherwise have been impossible to secure. From Quebec to Ogdensburg, from the endless march of the 104th to the resilient walls of La Colle Mills, the story of British Canada in wartime is the story of winter, its brutality, its demands, and its protection. For 4 decades, winter shaped the conflict as surely as any general's orders. And in mastering winter, Britain held an entire northern half of a continent against every attempt to wrest it away. The wars fought across the frozen expanses of British North America between 1775 and 1815 left behind a legacy deeper than the official histories and battle reports. They reshaped the way nations understood the northern frontier. They demonstrated how climate could mold strategy, identity, and survival. Above all, they revealed how winter, in all its ferocity, became not just a season, but a central force that defined the course of conflict and the destiny of a continent. The first and most enduring legacy was strategic. Britain learned that holding Canada did not require overwhelming armies or constant offensive action. Instead, it required intelligence, preparation, and the ability to exploit the most formidable natural barrier in North America, winter. The survival of Quebec in 1775 and 76 provided the template. Carleton's defensive choices, prioritizing strong positions, conserving manpower, and using the fortress as a bastion against both the enemy and the elements, became foundational principles. They showed that the key to defending the northern colonies lay in controlling the strongpoints along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, reinforcing them before winter set in, and enduring the cold season with discipline and resolve. These lessons echoed decades later in the War of 1812. When American strategists envisioned conquering Canada, their plans repeatedly collided with the reality of frozen terrain, blocked rivers, and the sheer difficulty of sustaining large armies in winter conditions. Where summer offered opportunities for campaigns, winter closed the land and immobilized water routes. It forced armies into defensive postures, leaving only the most daring or desperate operations possible. The Americans often suffered the most from this constraint. Their long supply lines, spread across vast and unfamiliar territory, strained under winter's harshness. Their offensives demanded mobility and logistical support that seldom survived the cold intact. By contrast, British forces embraced winter as part of their operational planning. With shorter supply lines anchored by fortified positions, the British could maintain cohesion even during the harshest freezes. The march of the 104th Regiment exemplified how the British adapted not by resisting winter, but by harnessing it. That regiment's grueling journey across more than 1,000 kilometers demonstrated that movement in winter, while punishing, was possible with the right equipment, local assistance, and steadfast discipline. It ensured that key garrisons were reinforced precisely when they were needed most. It also proved that British command could coordinate vast, winter-bound movements in ways the Americans had not anticipated. The second legacy was cultural and regional. Winter warfare reshaped the relationship between British soldiers and the Canadian landscape. Soldiers who arrived from Britain unaccustomed to extreme cold soon learned the survival techniques developed by indigenous nations and French-Canadian communities. Snowshoes, toboggans, moccasins, layered clothing, insulated huts, sleigh transportation. These methods were not just borrowed, but integrated into military practice. Over time, This fusion of European discipline with local knowledge produced a new form of frontier soldiering. The British Army in Canada became a winter army, forged in frost and adapted to conditions found nowhere else in the Empire. This transformation also deepened ties between soldiers and the communities they defended. In remote settlements along the St. Lawrence or in the snowy interiors of New Brunswick, civilians provided food, lodging, transport, and guidance to troops on the move. The bonds formed during winter marches and harsh campaigns helped solidify the colonial population's role in the defense of British North America. Loyalty was not merely a political position, it was a tangible, shared experience shaped by seasons of hardship. Indigenous nations contributed profoundly to this relationship. Their knowledge of winter travel, hunting, and shelter became vital to British operations. Their involvement in the War of 1812, particularly in guiding patrols and advising commanders, helped safeguard the frontier at moments when British forces were stretched thin. Winter leveled traditional military distinctions, placing equal value on the skills of indigenous allies and the discipline of regular troops. Their contributions were woven into the broader tapestry of the Northern defense. A third legacy emerged in the psychology of war on the frontier. Winter imposed a unique mental strain that shaped the attitudes of soldiers and commanders alike. The constant threat of frostbite, the monotony of snowbound watch duty, the fear of thin ice, and the isolation of remote posts all left indelible marks on those who served. Winter made caution a virtue. It demanded patience, humility, and a deep respect for nature's power. Commanders learned to time their movements around the freeze and thaw of rivers. Soldiers learned to fight not only the enemy, but also the instinct to retreat into warmth and safety when the cold pressed in. These psychological challenges, endured year after year, hardened the British presence in Canada. They created a culture in which endurance was a mark of pride and where resilience became its own kind of weapon. The victories secured in winter, Ogdensburg, Le Col Mills, the survival of Quebec, owed as much to this spirit as to muskets or cannons. Finally, winter's legacy can be seen in the broader contours of North American history. Britain's ability to hold Canada through 4 decades of intermittent conflict shaped the modern map of the continent. Had Quebec fallen in 1775, or had the Americans gained control of the St. Lawrence in 1813 or 1814, the political boundaries of North America might look vastly different today. Winter, exploited by British strategy and endured by British soldiers and Canadian communities, played a critical role in preventing such outcomes. By the end of the War of 1812, it was clear that the northern frontier could not be conquered by sheer force. It required a mastery of climate, geography, and logistics that no invading army had yet achieved. Britain's success in this environment laid the foundation for the enduring stability of Canada as a northern nation distinct from the United States, shaped not by conquest or political decree alone, but by the frozen battlefields and snowbound marches that defined its early defense. In this story, spanning 40 years of conflict, winter emerges as more than a backdrop. It is a character in its own right, altering the course of battles, shaping the decisions of officers, and forging the resilience of soldiers. It humbled ambitious invasions and rewarded those who respected its power. Through blizzards, frozen rivers, endless forests, and impenetrable cold, winter stood beside Britain as a silent, unyielding ally. And in the end, it was winter, alongside human endurance, that helped Britain hold a continent. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.